one of the founders of Beehive Climate. Really appreciate you guys all joining us today. Huge thank you first and foremost to Asana and to Sean for hosting us in this awesome speakeasy place. The bourbon starts pouring at 10:30, so just make it a little bit longer. For those of you who know me, about half of you, you know I love to talk. I have a lot of things to say. I think everyone should be listening more often, but I'm going to keep it short for this particular one because we have an amazing group of people. So Sean McPhillips, Director of ESG from Asana, is going to say a few words. After that, Patrick Flynn, who was the SVP of Sustainability for Salesforce for many, many years, is going to say a few words. And we have this amazing panel. Grant Harrison from Trellis Group is going to interview Senator Wiener, as well as Vid Prabhakaran, the ESG partner in charge from San Francisco's Davis Wright Tremaine office. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Sean.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. The regulation that we are here to discuss and address is going to get a lot of us from 0 to 1, and then we hope the connections that were built today and the discussions that are going to happen will help us get from 1 to 2 to 3 on climate action. So please, thank you so much, and please connect and share information with one another. Patrick, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Exactly what Sean said. I think you all have the hardest job in the world, trying to manage all of your work responsibilities and address a climate emergency that's more urgent than ever. And you need each other. We need each other to move faster, to help each other, and to move into collective action together. I just want to point out that understanding climate risk and opportunity is a gateway into lighting up your company to do even more, to get motivated to outcompete your nearest rival. And nonetheless, we're all in this together. So I hope everyone will meet somebody new, share where you're stuck, share what you're excited about, and leave here with greater connections so you can move farther, faster together. And thank you all for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. All right, Grant.
Fantastic. Let's get into it. So I will say also, be ready to chime in with Q&A. I'm sure you have questions and we're happy to take them, but start with a little conversation first. I'm going to chime in with the thanks to Adriel. Thanks to Sean for hosting us. I'm really happy to be here hosting this conversation. I'm a proud constituent of District 11 and also an avid consumer of Devil's Tooth baked goods. So fronts there. You all were already introduced. Let's get right into it, starting with you, Senator Wiener. Can you paint a picture of, I was going to say why now, but I guess why then in 2023 when this started to unfold? Like, what about the enabling environment allowed these laws to be passed in this time?
Well, it really started in late 2020 when a group called Carbon Accountable came to me and said we have an idea for a bill to require large corporations to disclose their carbon emissions. And it seemed like a good idea to me. It seemed logical. I did not realize at the time what a huge fight it would be, because it seemed fairly basic, just basic data disclosure for large companies that clearly have the resources to be able to collect that data. And so we introduced the bill in 2021. It took us 3 years to get it across the finish line. And in 2022, we actually got it all the way through the Senate and to the Assembly floor, and it failed by 1 vote on the Assembly floor. And then the next year, we were able to pass it by the skin of our teeth off of the Assembly floor. And it's been on, and the governor ultimately signed it, and it's been a continuing fight ever since then. Just a lot of efforts to sabotage implementation of the bill, the lawsuit by the oil industry, shilling, the Chamber of Commerce is shilling for the oil industry basically to sue. And I think ultimately what allowed us to get it across the finish line was we had a great coalition of environmental advocates, but we always had some business support. But by the 3rd year, we had a pretty robust sustainability-minded corporate coalition behind the bill. Ceres was one of the co-sponsors of the bill, but we had a list of corporations that were directly supporting it, ranging from Patagonia and Dignity Health and Salesforce and Microsoft. And at the end, Apple and Google came on board. And so, and Netflix doesn't officially endorse bills, but they were helping. And so it really helped us um, basically call out the falsehood that the opposition was stating, that this is somehow not feasible, impossible, overly expensive, all just made up stuff. But I could go to my colleagues and say, you don't have to believe me. Look at all these major corporations who are either they're already doing it, they're saying it's feasible, and so that really, I think, made the difference in putting it over the top.
I want to get to some of the made up stuff a little later on. You put it refreshingly bluntly that the Chamber of Commerce is functioning as a shill for the oil industry. Passing any bill into law requires compromise and negotiation, as you're well aware. Can you elucidate a little bit about how you went about that process of what negotiations were made, what kind of compromises need to be made in that process? Obviously, this room is full of people who understand more information is better than less information, but that isn't not an opinion that's shared widely.
Yeah, they're also shilling for the banks too. So it's sort of, those are the two twin towers that really don't want this to happen. Um, uh, we, in any legislation, it's, for me, it's not just about, like, you have to win for the sake of winning. I want to get it right. And so we, throughout the process with SB 253, we engaged with opposition, and we made amendments in response to feedback from opposition, even though they were still going to fight the bill. If they had valid feedback, we listened and took action. So, for example, one of the biggest changes we made is early on, the opposition, the California Chamber of Commerce and others, came to us and said, we don't, in terms of scope 3, if you require us to get precise data for every micro supplier around the world, that's going to be really hard and potentially impossible, because you're, first of all, you say this is about large corporations, but it's effectively sweeping in small businesses, and with a global supply chain, that's just going to be too much. And so we took a hard look at that and made a big change to the bill to say that you don't have to have that precise supplier by supplier carbon emission data. You can use well-established formulas and estimates, and there's software for that. And so that was like a big change that we made to the bill. We also provided more of an on-ramp for scope 3 disclosures. So 2026 is when full scopes 1 and 2 disclosures are required. And then it's another year, 2027, for scope 3, and that's the limited assurance. And then by 2030, they have to do the reasonable assurance. And so we also provided the Air Resources Board authority as of, I think it's 2032 or 2033, to reevaluate whether the GHG protocols are still the right protocols. They wanted that authority sooner, and I said no to that, because honestly, I think I have some concerns about CARB, and we know that GHG protocol is the gold standard now, and I don't want them to be able to mess with that.
Got it. And bigger picture question, it almost sounds like a dumb one, but it's worth addressing, which is why lead on this? Why, leadership is obviously a positively charged word for moral and ethical reasons, but functionally, why take the lead on an issue like this?
Yeah, I mean, on various issues, whether it's regulating technology or climate action, California should and must lead, because the federal government is sometimes leading, but not always. So here, even though we know with the Inflation Reduction Act, that was a massive step by Congress and President Biden, just really transformative. On other policies, federal government has not been able to move forward. So the SEC attempted to adopt a carbon disclosure rule. It was always more narrower than what we were proposing, in part because they only regulate publicly traded companies. Our bill applies to all large corporations, public and privately held. But we were still cheerleading the SEC, and that rule gradually just shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk to the point of being, I'm not criticizing SEC. They had incredibly difficult political currents, but it became a very, very narrow rule, which is probably going to be promptly revoked by the new administration. And so that just elevates the importance of California leading. We are honestly the only, I think the only state. New York is potentially the only other one that is in a position to do that as the fifth largest economy in the world, 40 million people. We really have the ability, in the absence of federal action, to lead and to help lead the country. And that's why we know they're going to come at us for a million different ways. And as chair of the Senate Budget Committee, that's concerning to me because they're going to try to hurt us in the pocketbook. And they're going to attack us on these policies as well because they don't want us to lead. Because when California requires, all large corporations doing business in California to do something, that covers a lot of corporations. We estimate 5,500 will be covered by SB 253, and that has national impacts.
So when you say it, sticking with the federal government level, going to attack us, and then I want to get into the weeds version of this question with you, since you spend a lot of time seeing what's in those weeds with
Yep.
clients who want to know what's in there. Overriding question on all kind of climate litigation is what can these attacks afford? With things like the IRA, it's easier to maybe paint a picture of, well, X, high percentage of dollars are going to red states, so there's like a material commercial interest for a lot of folks in red states to protect this, whatever. When it comes to these two disclosure and climate risk bills, what can those attacks, like, what's the worst case, I guess, that you could envision that you don't want to see happen that would result from those attacks?
Yeah.
And how are you guiding clients through that?
Never underestimate the willingness of Republicans to promote policies that hurt their own constituents. We know, for example, red districts have in California have disproportionate folks on Medi-Cal, way above the blue areas, and yet they, they advocate to destroy Medicaid. Blue state Republicans, many of them, or some of them at least, supported limiting tax deductions for Californians. One of them lost her seat over it, which she deserved to lose. But the Republicans, they don't really don't seem to care if policies that the mothership sends out hurt their own constituent. But here we know we have this lawsuit which is proceeding, and we're doing well in the lawsuit so far, but they're determined to keep it going. We don't know if they're going to try, if Trump and his allies in Congress are going to try to preempt us, and then that would be litigation, because we would not just accept that legally. We also know that they are engaging in and they have for a long time, bully-like behavior against corporations. We've seen that with the red state attorneys general and governors trying to, intimidate and bully corporations into not pursuing ESG strategies. We now see, if you look at who's writing $1 million checks to Trump's inauguration, including some folks who, frankly, it would have been surprising 6 or 12 months ago, but everyone's sort of falling into line right now, which is, I guess it's just the world that we're in. And so there's that kind of pressure that they are able to put on as well, because this federal administration is basically a kleptocracy. It is, and we can see that on so many different ways. And so there's going to be increased pressure on corporations to just do what they need to do politically to be in good graces, so that Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Vivek and all the other ones, lift up their finances instead of knocking them down. I'm just being blunt, but that's sort of the reality that we live in right now.
And same question to you, Vid, but I'm going to add on to giving us a little more color on do business in California, giving us more clarity on what that means.
Yeah.
What you're telling clients.
Yeah, I mean, the number one question that folks who are out of state come and ask me is, do we qualify as doing business in California? They clearly hit the revenue thresholds as a global company, and so their question is, what does it mean to do business in California? And so that question is still a bit of an open question, because you are waiting on the California Air Resources Board to weigh in on that and to actually give us sort of clarity on that. I think Scott would say, rope as many folks in as possible. The point here is the moral good associated with this. And for some of the companies, they're sort of like, yeah, well, we're going to move forward. we've already been doing a lot of this. This is a chance for us to prove it to the world. And so they're moving forward and taking it. Many of the bill sponsors, I think, would fall into that category. The folks who are just sort of on the fence and are swept in and kind of don't know what they don't know are looking at their org chart and they're saying, well, I have a California subsidiary. Obviously, that California subsidiary is subject to this requirement. But do I, as the parent company, fall into this? I have worldwide operations, but my California subsidiary doesn't, and so what gets swept in, what doesn't? And so you'll have these situations, right, where you have a California subsidiary. The California subsidiary obviously is doing business in California, but it alone does not necessarily hit the revenue threshold. And so they're sitting there questioning, well, do I get swept in or not? And so that,
They're in.
you know,
Yeah, I mean, even if they don't have a California subsidiary, if they're doing business in California, if they're selling in California,
Mhm.
they're in. And the goal here is we're protecting Californians. That's the goal. We're not providing data for California to help with California's efforts around understanding carbon emissions and understanding what we need to do. But yeah, as long as they're doing business in California, then the whole company is subject.
And so, I mean, I think the question mark, Scott, is okay, if the parent company, is it the parent company doing business by virtue of owning the subsidiary when it's not necessarily itself marketing into California?
Yeah,
know?
yes. The answer is yes. And I think it's also important to keep in mind here, this is not like a regulation in the sense like, minimum wage where it's your employees in California who are covered. This is about information. We're not telling companies how you have to conduct your business.
Right.
And so if we were trying to force companies around the world to say you have to use this kind of technology or you have to use this, do this, but not that, that I think that would be a different question. Here, it's nothing more than information, no more than saying if you're doing business in California, we need certain data about your corporate governance, even though that some of that governance is in California and some is not. And so that's also one of the biggest um, uh, issues that I have with some of the opposition to the law that because this is simply data, it's just information, and that there is this intense, not, I mean, a lot of companies are just like, fine, we're doing it, but intense opposition in some quarters says that it's not, to me, it's not about like it being difficult or you're trying to like regulate outside of California, which we're not. We're just asking for data. It's because they do not want to show that data because the data may not look good and they may not be accurately portraying themselves as green.
So that actually kind of touches on a bigger picture view of this corporate sustainability work that's been done by many people in this room for longer than anyone could have done the work, which is that corporate sustainability has largely been about just more and better information, particularly for one audience, which is investors who want it to make certain decisions that are climate aligned. And a lot of the pushback that we receive doesn't align with that. It doesn't make sense what they're pushing back on. It's not trying to achieve what you can't achieve at the ballot box or anything you might read in a Wall Street Journal op-ed by Mike Pence. So what is the bigger picture view from your vantage point, since this is just a demand for more information? It's not compelling behavior. It's not trying to force change around climate. 10 years on, looking back, we're sitting back in this speakeasy eating devil's tooth again. What are you looking back on to say what these two sets of laws did?
Well, I think it's really about it's about information for consumers, right? I mean, just a very simplistic kind of example. If it turns out that Coke and Pepsi are both disclosing their carbon emissions, and some smart people are able to then boil that down to one can of Coke has this much carbon behind it, one can of Pepsi has that much, then a California consumer, and that's not just physically what's happening in California, it's data for that creation of that product that's being sold in California. A consumer might say, oh, wow, a can of Pepsi takes half as much carbon to make it than a can of Coke. And the consumer might be like, I'm going to go with the can with Pepsi. Very simplistic example, but I think I think that it's, at a basic level, that's what we're talking about in terms of consumers. Investors, with both of these laws, can decide who has greater or lesser climate risk, if that this company or this industry is not taking carbon reduction seriously. And down the road, we think that companies that are, like really, really, really carbon intensive are going to have problems economically, or whatever the case may be. So it's important information for me as an investor to know that this company is trying to, decarbonize. This company is not. And then for policymakers, understanding which sector, like where the carbon is coming from. And sometimes we know that there are certain sectors that are more carbon intensive than others, but there may be sectors that we don't even realize how carbon intensive they are because the data is all secret and there's no consistency in disclosing it. So I think in a variety of contexts over time, it could provide very, very useful information. And that's why some corporate actors don't want anyone to lift up the hood.
Yeah, I mean, on that question, I often point to, the arc of other regulations to say, like, look, we're at the start of something here with this. This is the first requirement for data in this space, right? But this isn't the first request for data in other spaces, right? We've done this with greenhouse gas emissions for years, and the arc is very similar. It started with a mandatory reporting requirement of your greenhouse gas emissions. There was nothing further than that. It was just you needed to report. It's just data. And then eventually, the legislature said, okay, we're going to create a standard now. We're going to create an emissions portfolio standard associated with the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to, over time, for the good of Californians, reduce the amount of emissions. And that requirement has driven so much of the investment, not only in California, but globally, with greenhouse gas reduction. I don't think that that is going to be all that different here. The timing of this is unclear. And for most of my clients, my statement to them is like, look, you may not be prepared for this right now. This is an opportunity for you to flex this muscle and learn how to do it. And so you might as well get there because look, the arc of this is going to be no different than the arc with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and other similar reporting requirements. Eventually, the requirement is going to be to reduce. And if you're caught flat-footed because you've decided today that I don't want to report this, I don't want to get there, well, you're going to have a whole lot of hurt coming in later. And so why not, when there's a grace period and when there is a period of general learning about how to do this going on, why not get in now and put a little bit of budget behind this so that you can start to flex that muscle and get better at it. So there's a lot of that I do see a future where this will be perhaps more resource intensive, but the resources you're putting behind it are ultimately going to benefit your company. And so, getting it incrementally started now makes a lot of sense.
And yeah, and I agree, and I think, and I keep coming back to this about like some of the made up arguments about, oh, it's too hard, it's too expensive, which it's not. And we made various changes to the bill
Yeah.
to make it as seamless and user friendly as possible, and we were really intentional about that. But the fact that we know the major industries that are really behind so much of the opposition, oil industry, which can never look good here because it's inherently carbon intensive industry, no matter how, no matter how much of the green color they put in their marketing campaigns. And then the banks, which there are some banks who are taking it more seriously, like Amalgamated Bank supported the bill. So I'm not broad brushing all banks. It's different than the oil industry in that sense. But we also know that there are banks who they don't want to have to, disclose what some of their, what some of their loans and investments are in terms of the carbon intensivity. So that's why they have been so aggressive against it.
But many of those larger banks are going to be tied up in CSRD and other regulations. They're going to ask for the same information. So on back to your vantage point from in the weeds, like how how much can you really make out of that opposition? Like, I guess what I'm asking is tying together the various myriad acronyms that are requiring the same information. How much of this is really new for institutions?
I mean, Scott made sure in the bill to say, I want to have that connection point, right? Like, if you're complying with something over there, that should be sufficient to comply with us here. And like, that's very clear in the bill. You know, the question mark that we're still waiting on the Air Resources Board, is to say how that looks, how that applies. You know, what do we, you know, how are we actually functionally doing that? And so, you know, all of us, you know, for those of you who probably aren't paying as close attention to the Air Resources Board as I am, they have not yet started their rulemaking. And they blamed it on the fact that they didn't have enough staff to begin their rulemaking. So they got that out of the budget, thanks to Scott, for out of this cycle. But they have not yet hired. And so they're like today in the process of hiring the staff they need to actually do this rulemaking, which, by the way, they're supposed to be done with July 1st.
Which was an extension.
Yes, which was already an extension. And so if they're hiring for their people today, the typical sort of you know, state hiring process means that they're not going to have their individuals onboarded till March. That's, you know, and then, you know, give the poor people who get hired a month to like get up to speed and implement and develop a set of regulations. You know, we're talking about a month or two, you know, before this can actually see the light of, you know, see the light of day for all the companies who are there to comply. The Air Resources Board has already said, look, we're just looking for good faith in year one. You know, do the best you can with what's available to you today, and we're not going to come prosecute you. Because the reality is that there are a whole lot of businesses that are ostriching right now and saying, we don't need to do this, right? And those, we assume, are going to be the folks that people go after first. You know, if you are actually doing something in the space, you are likely not going to be a target. But it's one of these things where, you know, going back to the original question, if you are already doing something in Europe and you're already trying to meet some of the greenhouse gas protocols, you are pretty far ahead of the game with respect to some of your competitors and or sort of colleagues in the space that are ostriching right now.
Yeah, and that was another, and I should have mentioned that earlier in terms of an amendment that we made during the process, is we're not asking people to recreate the wheel. If you're already reporting everything required under 253, say in another jurisdiction like the EU, or if another state were to adopt something, then you could literally just, you know, proverbially staple that report and submit it. Or if you're, you know, reporting 2/3 of what we're requiring in another jurisdiction, you can staple that and then just add the additional third. So we tried to make it seamless. In terms of CARB, you know, you know, we gave them an additional 6 months. They can get the regs done by July 1st, and my expectation is that they will issue regulations by July 1st. But we also need to recognize that that what we're asking for in this bill is not something brand new. So yes, the regs are important, but it's asking for disclosure under the GHG protocols, which so many companies already do, which are established protocols. And while there might be some process questions that the regs need to iron out, those are frankly around the edges, and the heart of what companies have to do. They know what to do, because this is I mean, the protocols are referenced in the law. And there's no question about what a bank or this kind of company or that kind of company is required to do under the GHG protocols.
Scott, I'm going to push back just a little bit on that. Like, I think that for the largest companies, many of whom already have sustainability departments, have risk departments where this is housed, they know and have been doing some portion of this for years. I think the clients that are coming to me today are typically U.S. only companies, so they're not in Europe, have not had to face any of the requirements there. They're vaguely aware of the greenhouse gas protocols, but they've been, you know, more aware of the SEC, and so, you know, because they all fully expect the SEC requirement to go away, they're sort of like, okay, I guess we need to focus in California now. And so they're coming, looking for a California lawyer, and like, okay, yep, I can help you. And they come to me and they say, okay, am I required to do this, right? And they're still at the am I required to do this stage, and they're uncomfortable. My response is most likely yes. Like the answer is most likely yes, you are going to be required to do this. And they're skeptical because they're like, well, we have this corporate structure that should allow us to insulate at least some portion of our business. And as Scott just said, like, no, like you're in. Um, the challenge though is that they have spent a lot of time and effort to build a corporate structure, to have subsidiaries, in part to insulate themselves from certain requirements in different states. Like that is just part of the way that they have set themselves up. And it's not for some nefarious reason. It's often just normal liability issues. But they're expecting that this sub will sort of insulate them from the requirement for the time being.
Can I also ask, this is my last practical question,
Yeah.
and I'm going to turn it over to the people who actually do this work. When you're saying they, for the companies who are coming to you who don't have a robust corporate sustainability
Right.
team, they've never had a person called the sustainability something rather.
Exactly.
Who do you advise owns this work? Who's like when paint a picture of who they
Yeah.
is on their end
Yeah, that's-
in terms of the org chart? Who's
So-
doing this?
So great question. It's almost always either the CFO or the GC. Who the GC is looking at this because it's now a compliance requirement, and so they're like, okay, this falls under my ambit. CFO is looking at this because it's risk, and so if you have an enlightened CFO, the CFO is coming to you and saying, this needs to be part of my risk assessment going forward, so make it happen, and so the company's going to do it. The GC is usually the opposite. The GC is coming and saying, do I need to comply and advise my company that it complies? Please tell me no, because I don't want to be yet another reason to impose cost on the company, right? And so it's usually the GCs who are like, please tell me the answer is no, I don't have to comply. And I unfortunately typically go to them and say, probably yes, you need to plan on it, and they throw things at me. But it's one of these things where practically speaking, it's in those components. And so, the reality is that most of them are tacking this on as an additional responsibility for now and budgeting for future cycles to actually add headcount or at least a quarter FTE, half FTE to start down this process. But that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about flexing the muscle. It's right. It's like you all who are already in this world understand the sort of value add that it can provide. And if you have largely been doing this as a paper exercise, then it's often a distinguisher that you're thinking about leaning into to make it worthwhile to do, right? Because if it is just a paper exercise right now, then it's just awful. Nobody at your company wants to be doing this. They're like, this is awful. This is just an extra dollars. And it's like, well, you can actually take advantage of this. Here are different ways of doing so, question mark whether they do or not. But the stick is coming, so regardless, do it. But typically what I'm seeing is starts with the GC. The GC says, oh God, advises the board. The board eventually says, okay, we need to have a sustainability person. That person is typically a quarter or half FTE associated with a broader risk program, gets staffed into the CFO's office, goes from there.
Well, we only have a precious minutes left. You beat me to it. Go for it.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for being here today. We just heard about sticks, and Scott, I would like to encourage you to think about carrots and incentives for the future, because the inevitable downstream effect of this information disclosure will be selected penalties for taxes and regulations in years to come, which is one way to do it. But I think the better way to do it is to really think about incentives. How do we really move people to do the right thing rather than just penalizing them? What is the kind of incentives, tax credits, and beyond?
You can also give us your name, where you're from.
Yeah, Ettore, San Francisco, and Udemy, online learning.
I mean, there are plenty of carrots. I mean, the Congress passed the largest climate investment in the history of world, maybe, I don't know, certainly the country, with huge subsidies for many, many, many different activities. California has a lot of climate-related subsidies. to try to encourage, individuals, businesses to, do good things around climate. And this bill, I don't think this law is in any way a stick. It's about data disclosure. A stick would be like banning, right? That's more of a stick. And we do that sometimes. There are certain things you can't do. But this is really just, it's transparency. So I don't even view it as as a, as a stick for
No,
people.
but I think the data coming out of this will lead to new legislation and new benefits.
Right. Well, it could lead to both. It could lead to it could lead to regulations or restrictions, and it can also lead to incentives, right? Because it could lead to, hey, this industry is more carbon intensive than we want. Why don't we provide, say, a tax credit for them to do X, Y, or Z? So I think it'll lead to probably both. So, but I agree with you that they're both important.
I will say, I mean, the stick associated with 253 in particular is driving a number of the businesses that are consulting with me to actually go down the path of counting. Many of these companies are not even doing any sort of emissions accounting whatsoever right now. But for the fact that, gosh, I could either spend $500,000 to start that process and start counting, or I could pay a penalty. Well, then it's an obvious choice, right? And that's good, because once you start counting, you start to think about, well, what do I do with this data that I now have? And there's, frankly, oftentimes low-hanging fruit. And that gets people excited, right? The most low-hanging fruit for almost everybody is, guess what? You reduce your carbon when you reduce your costs associated with consumption. So if you consume less, you're going to save some money. And so that gets people excited, because you're talking, you start thinking about energy efficiencies, you start thinking about your fleets and modernizing equipment, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are investments that are obvious. And then you start doing some of the harder things for these companies that actually will cost some money, but have other societal benefits and employee retention benefits and recruiting benefits and marketing benefits, some of the softer stuff that is, kind of requires a culture shift within the companies themselves. And so you sort of walk down that life cycle at your company. I know for all of you who are nodding your heads, you're like, yep, this is exactly what I'm banging my head against. It's like, okay, it's easy to get them hooked on the energy efficiencies, because it's like, all right, I'm bringing the cost down for the company. This is good. People are good with this. It's harder to get them to start thinking about some of the bigger cultural things.
Thanks for your question. Sean.
Yeah, Sean from Asana. Senator Wiener, with the SEC requirements going away, what do you think are the likelihood of other jurisdictions mirroring the California requirements, at the state level?
I don't know. I know that there was a bill in New York that I don't think passed. I don't know the exact status of every bill. I do think, again, this is true. Not sometimes we got it with this bill. I've gotten it with in other subject areas where people are like, no, 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 this should be handled at the federal level. But then the same people and companies that are saying this should be handled at the federal level are the exact same ones that are killing it at the federal level. We saw this with net neutrality, where AT&T and Comcast and Verizon killed federal net neutrality back in 2018. So I introduced a California net neutrality bill, and they had the gall to go around the Capitol saying this should be handled at the federal level, after they had literally just themselves directly killed it at the federal level. And so I would but here we know that the federal is not acting, and it's important for California to act to provide information for California residents about companies doing business in California. And so I do think, ideally, if other states are doing this, they would really take a look at what we did, because to try to reduce any kind of inconsistencies.
I have a question for you as well, Scott. For those of us who have been doing this for years.
Give us your name and
Sorry,
your
Hannah
organization.
Upwork. For those of us who have been doing emissions accounting for years, we have been reporting this information for years. We are ready, and we are also, frankly, I'll speak for myself, probably not my whole entire company, grateful to have this regulation in place, because I think without it, we would see a lot more companies backsliding. how can we help?
Yeah.
With litigation coming up, with those risks, is there a way for the companies who are saying, we are prepared, we are this many assets under management, we are this many, our market cap is valued at this, and we have figured this out? Yeah, how can we help?
Yeah. And also, in addition to the risk of backsliding without a law in the books, it's also just inconsistency, like selective reporting by companies because there's no accountability. They can, so, I think just the political support is important, and I think for business leaders to reassure the governor and the Air Resources Board that this is important and that people are looking to California for leadership, particularly with what's happening in Washington. And in terms of the litigation, and I'm not following all the minutia of the litigation, and I don't know if any companies have like intervened with amicus briefs, but that would be a good thing too, because we have the argument that it's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, California Chamber of Commerce, American Petroleum Association, or Institute, et cetera. I think one of the main or the main arguments that they're making is a truly obscene extremist argument. It's that SB 253 somehow violates the First Amendment by forcing companies to speak. Well, what is that speech? It's data. And so if a court were to accept that bizarre argument, what does that mean for SEC disclosures? What does that mean for all the myriad ways in which government requires corporations to provide disclosures for various important purposes? So with the way the courts are now, I never make any assumptions. But I think that even for the way the courts are now, it just seems like a really, really extreme argument. But I think, yeah, having corporate involvement in the litigation is good too.
I would actually add to that, just, for companies that are doing this, if you are leaders, touting that you're leaders in a more expansive way can be really helpful. Because, the sort of just business competitive landscape is such that if you are able to distinguish yourselves in this way amongst your competitors, it actually sort of shames your competitors a bit into following suit and not signing on to some of the litigation efforts that the chamber might be taking on, or a trade association might be following. And so that can be extremely helpful because it just shines a light on everybody that, like, hey, look, Upwork, leader in the space, is doing this already. Stop pretending you can't handle it, right? So I think that can be really helpful.
Time for one more.
Yeah.
I'm gonna break my looking in this direction bias and look in this direction.
Uh-huh.
See if there's any hands. No hands in this direction. I didn't even break my bias. Okay, there you go.
Hi, Nico Van Alstam with Shepherd Mullen. And I was just at COP29 in Baku, and there was a shortfall in terms of public financing and a big debate about that. But at the same time, the Article 6 regulations went through to encourage private financing to address the climate crisis. So this is more 261 than 253. But in terms of mitigating climate risk, do you see an opening for more carbon finance as a way to be recognized as a strategy to address mitigation for those companies that have unavoidable emissions?
So in terms of the carbon risk in SB 261, I prefer not to comment too much on that because Senator Stern led on that bill, and I'm not as deep in that space. So I probably don't want to get over my skis on that one.
I'd love to get your take on it, actually. I mean, that's a super important question. I mean, I assume many of your clients are saying, look, I would like this as a way to sort of offset
Yeah.
my.
And frankly, this is something that is going to be in the realm of ARB, because, 261 does have language that would allow ARB to provide guidance with regard to what would be acceptable mitigation strategies. And with the increasing efforts to provide greater accountability and credibility for the carbon finance, I think that there are real opportunities there.
Yeah, fully agree.
one more burning desire. We have time.
Maybe 1 minute left.
Okay.
And then it's your left.
So yep.
Quick one, maybe.
Yep.
Andy from Phil's Coffee.
Hi.
Curious if there are plans, and I might just be behind, to start bringing it down to more smaller businesses and creating criteria and regulations for us as well. California's been great on some of the single use and other things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have any current plans to lower the $1 billion threshold. You know, I'm sure there are plenty of people there are people who would love to do that, and if they wanted to propose that, that would be a conversation. But we think that the $1 billion threshold really does sweep in an awful lot of activity, and so we feel good about it.
And look, to some degree, you will be swept in by virtue of Scope 3. And so, as Scope 3 continues to see more and more granular data being collected, the smaller companies may begin to see value in standing up these internally themselves. Because their own vendors will also have started to collect this data and be able to provide it. And so, again, it's an ecosystem that's being created. It's a marketplace that's being created, et cetera. And when you're thinking about flexing the muscle, like, low cost solutions to start flexing the muscle are really, really critical. And I'm going to throw a bone to our sponsors here. Part of what made Beehive available and useful for the market was like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here in this space. I need something that will get me flexing this muscle and get me compliant with this rule. Can you solve for that, right? And so if you have a low-cost solution to provide that as an initial measure to start flexing that muscle, it's really, really valuable for getting the people internally to get on board with this and sort of move forward with the life cycle of it. So, look for those kind of solutions because I think they're going to be really helpful to you as you, embark on this arc.
I think we're gonna have to leave the conversation there. Thank you, Vid, for joining us. Thank you, Senator Wiener, for your time. And
Thank you.
all for participating.
Thank you.
Turn it back over to you guys.
Guys, thank you so much. Asana, Sean, huge. This place is awesome. Really appreciate it. Devil Steve, 2 shout outs. With that last comment, you and yourself a free lifetime supply of biscuits because we got a lot left. Thank you all so much. Are we kicking everyone out, or we got 10
We have
minutes?
the space, so we want to be comfortable and let you, everyone can go about their day, but you're also welcome to stay and continue the conversation.
Beautiful. Thank you guys
Thanks, Sean.
so much. I really appreciate it.